This is one of the smallest mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras you can buy, and this is one of the smallest and cheapest lenses you can buy for it. Put them together and I believe this is quite possibly the ultimate travel or street photography camera setup, and it could even give the Fujifilm X100V and the Ricoh GR a run for their money. I mean, particularly when you consider that this whole setup cost me around a quarter of the price it would cost me to buy either of those other two cameras, and this one has the advantage of having interchangeable lenses. But anyway, this is the Panasonic Lumix GM1, and despite it being released 10 years ago, this camera is still more than capable of handling itself in 2024. Firstly, it just looks great. I really do love the classic styling of this camera, particularly with that leather finish and its overall minimalist design. The build quality is also excellent, as you would expect from a Panasonic camera, and it functions very well by today's standards. It really doesn't look or feel like a 10-year-old camera. But of course, the main selling point of this camera is its small stature, and just so you can tell exactly how small this thing is, it's actually just slightly smaller than a standard pack of playing cards. Plus, it only weighs just over 200 grams or around 7 ounces. Now, admittedly, when you attach this 18mm Pancake lens to the front, it does increase the overall depth and weight slightly, but needless to say, it is still very much a pocketable camera. And just to prove how pocketable it really is, I actually took this away with me recently on a skiing trip to Morzine in France. Well, I don't know if this is a UK problem or a worldwide problem, but budget airlines here in the UK specifically just try their best to rinse you for every penny possible when taking luggage. So I was limited to just taking a single carry-on bag for the entirety of the 4-day trip. And if you've ever been skiing before, you'll know that you have to take a fair amount of crap with you, and it's all very bulky. So having a camera that can literally tuck into your jacket pocket and live there was an absolute godsend. Now, despite this being one of the smallest mirrorless cameras ever made, there are actually cameras that are smaller than this, the most famous of which being the Pentax Q range of cameras. But this is only very fractionally larger than the Pentax Q cameras. We're literally talking millimeters here. Plus, the Pentax Q cameras did have a much smaller compact size sensor, whilst this GM1 packed in a respectable 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor, which is more than capable of spitting out images with bags of dynamic range and clarity. Now, we'll obviously dive into the image quality of this camera a little bit later on, but first let's talk about the size, because when creating a camera of this size, understandably compromises have to be made, and some of them will be fairly obvious and expected. For example, there's obviously going to be no hot shoe port or EVF, and although the screen is pretty big and bright, it is fixed in place, so you've got no tilt action here. There's also only one command dial, which also doubles as the D-pad, but the screen is actually touch sensitive, so most of the time when I was using this abroad, I was just quickly adjusting the settings and navigating the menu system with the touchscreen, which worked very well. Now on the top, there is a miniature little flash that you can bend back and bounce off the ceiling if you needed to in emergency, but let's face it, most of the time that's going to be sleeping down there. Also on the top plate we have a dedicated mode dial and also a separate dial for adjusting the camera drive mode. Now personally, I wish they'd just not even bothered with this drive mode dial. It seems a bit redundant when you've got a touchscreen, and I'd much rather have seen a dedicated exposure compensation dial, but that's just my own personal preference. All of that said, I do appreciate how much customization they have tried to fit into this camera, because although there is only one physical customizable button located in the middle of that drive mode dial I was just talking about, if you do tap this function tab at the bottom right of the touchscreen, then you do get access to 5 more customizable shortcuts, and there are a generous amount of settings that these can be allocated to. Now, although there's no built-in image stabilization, it does at least have a proper mechanical leaf shutter. Now, sadly, this is capped to a maximum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, and although that will be fine for most scenarios, going past that shutter speed will automatically switch the camera over to its electronic shutter. But the good news is that when using this electronic shutter, you can then achieve a maximum shutter speed as fast as 1/16,000th of a second, which coincidentally is the same amount of time I last in bed on a good day. Now, the only other compromise that has to be made when buying this camera is the grip, or lack of one, because although this leather band does its best to provide some kind of purchase, if you've got big hands or butterfingers, then you might want to consider getting some kind of wrist strap or a grip extension, or maybe even both. Now, I actually bought this camera in an eBay auction, and it actually came included with 2 different grips and this rather nice leather carry case, but I personally never felt like I actually needed to use any of these, mainly because this lens that I'm using has a very nice notched texture to it, which actually helps to provide provide a lot of purchase. Now, speaking of this lens, this is the 7 Artisans 18mm f6.3, which if you factor in the 2x crop generated by this micro four thirds sensor, you end up with photos that look something closer to a 36mm lens on a full frame camera. For me personally, I find this focal length to be the perfect travel companion, as it's just wide enough to capture scenic vistas, but also more than capable of handling itself when it comes to snapping candid photos of everyday life. But before I get too carried away and rattle on about this lens for too long, I also want to mention that all of the photos that you've seen so far have been edited RAW files taken with this camera and have been color graded using one of my brand new Lightroom presets that have just gone on sale on my equally brand new website. Now, I've got to say a big thank you to Pixper for sponsoring the build of this website, because using their super easy to use platform, I was able to build this entire website from scratch without any coding in just a few days. So if you're interested in buying my presets, just head over to tomcalton.com and use the discount code Pixper to get 20% off my entire preset pack. Or equally, if you want to learn more about how to create your own website using Pixper, then you can follow the links down in the description below. So anyway, back to this lens. It's fair to say that this is a fairly simplistic design, and the aperture is actually permanently fixed at f6.3, so you can't change it at all, whether it's on the lens or via the camera. But for street photography, honestly, that really doesn't matter that much anyway, because most of the time you're shooting at 5.6 or f8 anyway, and if you are shooting outdoors in good light like I was, the ISO on this camera will rarely go above 200. Now, this lens is also pretty damn cheap. It cost me around $55 from AliExpress, but of course, for a lens of this size and price, you are going to have to expect a little bit of character, shall we say, when it comes to image quality, and although the sharpness at the center of this lens isn't that bad, the corners are pretty soft. For me personally, that's not a deal breaker, because I'm more than happy for my personal work to be a little bit rough around the edges in exchange for having a lens that's just this small and lightweight. But if you do happen to have a bigger wallet and more self-respect than I do, then the good news is that there are plenty of small autofocus, prime and zoom lenses available for micro four thirds cameras like this, which will likely do a much better job. Now, on that note, the GM1 does have contrast detect AF rather than the more accurate face detect AF that we're used to seeing on more modern mirrorless cameras. So that said, I still found that the AF was more than reliable on this camera, especially when shooting outdoors in good lighting conditions. One final little observation I should mention is that when editing these photos, I did notice that if I tried to brighten the shadows a little bit too much, it would generate a fair amount of noise. However, because Lightroom these days has AI-driven noise reduction, this really wasn't a problem at all, because you can completely remove any trace of noise in just a few clicks. So how much did this camera cost? Well, as I've already mentioned, I bought this on eBay in an auction, and it cost me around £200, which is around $250 US. And I got particularly lucky because mine came included with a bunch of accessories, including 3 batteries and even an SD card. So overall, I got an absolute bargain. More commonly, I do see them listed around the $300 to $400 mark, depending of course on the condition and what they come bundled with. But still, in my opinion, that is a very fair price for such a portable yet powerful camera.